Good morning, everybody, again. My name is Sylvia and I have the privilege to chair this panel with three distinguished writers of the book we are launching here today. Before I introduce Caroline, Skip, and John, I would like to share one intimate information with you. Publishing this book was not easy. But thanks to the high professionalism of the three prominent scholars, as well as their wonderful personalities, our cooperation finally led to the desired outcome. So let me introduce our friends. And if you don't mind, gentlemen, I'll start with you. Caroline Mesrobian Hickman is an art and architectural historian who received her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, has over 30 years of experience researching and publishing on Washington architecture and 20th century American art. She's working on a book and exhibition about her paternal grandfather, Mihran Mesrobian, who served as an architect in the Imperial Palace in Istanbul and in Izmir before immigrating to Washington to become one of the city's leading designers during the 1920s. At my right side, Skip Moskey. He's an historical researcher who writes and speaks on Washington's Gilded Age. He's also writing a full-length biography of Lawrence and Isabel Anderson, one of Washington's most allied socialite couples who lived in Washington between 1898 and 1937. He currently serves as a consulting historian to the town of Brookline, Massachusetts. He holds a PhD in linguistics and modern European languages from Georgetown University. And last but not least, on my left side, John Edward Hasse. He's an author, pianist, museum curator, and lecturer. Since 1984, he has served as curator of American music at the Smithsonian Institutional National Museum of American History, where he founded the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra and Jazz Appreciation Months, now celebrated in all 50 states and in 40 countries. He is the author of Beyond Category, The Life and Genius of Duke Ellington, the editor of Jazz the First Century, the co-author of Discover Jazz, and the co-producer co-author of the Jazz, the Smithsonian Anthology. He has earned a doctorate, an honorary doctorate, and 2 Grammy Award nominations. A contributor to the Wall Street Journal and 8 encyclopedias, Hasse has frequently worked with the State Department and has lectured on jazz and American music in 20th century, in 20 countries. So, with this, I would like to give the floor to the authors, and Caroline can start with you, maybe, or you have an author.
Good morning, everybody here. I'm going to talk about the second chapter of the book, which is a new interpretation of Edward Hamlin Everett. When I started this chapter, my goals were to develop a fuller picture of Everett's youth. A lot was known about his industrial career, but very little was known about his youth. And I also wanted to develop a richer picture of what his life was like in Washington during the Gilded Age, which is my research interest. And I also wanted to humanize him. Often when we read biographies of Gilded Age personalities, we hear about the parties that they attended, the houses that they built, the wealth that they acquired, the jewels that they owned. But we have to remember that these were people that had problems, and Mr. Everett was a man who was not without problems. And I think that this helps us connect with this distant past of the city. We see these people as real people, as human beings, not as some gods on Mount Olympus. And I will be referring to him as Mr. Everett. That's how he was known in his lifetime, and even today in the Everett descendants, 2 and 3 generations later, they still refer to him as Mr. Everett. start by talking about what was the old interpretation of Mr. Everett. He was thought of and was a successful industrialist, and people said that he had unlimited wealth. He was said to be the inventor of the crimped metal bottle cap, which is now not as widely seen as it once was. It was said that he owned a very old chateau in Switzerland. It was said that he had met George Oakley Totten, the architect of this house in Istanbul, but not much else was known about him. And I thought this isn't a very complete picture of this important man. So let's go to the next slide. The book goes into quite a bit of detail about his youth and his family ancestry. And I wanted to know what was his view of himself, how did he think of himself. And one of the most important things that I learned about his youth is that he came from a very distinguished family. His mother, through his mother, he was related to Hannibal Hamlin, who was Abraham Lincoln's vice president. And on his father's side, his grandfather was a very successful farmer. So like many 19th century Americans, he had roots to the very strong connections to the land. And we'll see this later in some of his business interests that you might not have expected. But he also had a very deep appreciation of his family's and thus his own place in American history. We have the next slide. Oh, and this is the house that he lived in Cleveland. The book goes into the detail of his father and mother and his father dying, and for several years he lived with his Uncle Sylvester in this house. And what did he learn from Uncle Sylvester? Men who do well live in very large impressions. We know of Mr. Everett as being a bottle and glass manufacturer. This wasn't known about him, but he was involved in almost every area of capitalism and investment. Not only did he have a large interest in bottles and jars, he invested in real estate, and quite a bit of real estate. In the 19-teens and 20s, New York was growing. He invested in co-ops. He invested in an office building near Grand Central Terminal, and that was being built. If you could go to the next slide, please. He was a major investor in fruit and vegetable farming. He owned massive fruit and vegetable farms in Ohio, Texas, and in Vermont. He was involved in sand and rock quarrying, and of course that made sense. A glass manufacturer needs sand, but he owned his own quarries. That was a very economical way for him to get the raw materials that he needed for glass. He was also very heavily invested, in fact, over-invested in oil and gas. It never quite produced the return that he had hoped it would. This is a picture which is not in the book of one of his sand quarries in Ohio. And then he had a business investment in Washington in addition to his house here. In 1911, he bought the Hotel Richmond, which was on the corner opposite to the Metropolitan Club. And he spent the next 2 years, 1912 and 13, completely renovating the hotel and making it a place where ladies and families would stay. Prior to that, it was a more transitory hotel for businessmen traveling through the town. And I do want to thank Lenore Miller from George Washington University, who's here, for helping locate this photograph in the GW archives. So thank you, Lenore. I also found out that Mr. Everett was very well connected politically. When he applied for his first passport in 1907, it was mailed back to him care of the White House. Teddy Roosevelt was in the White House at that time. So you can see that he had quite a network that to say, well, just send my passport to the White House, I'll go get it there, is quite quite a sign of his connectedness to the powers that be. Everett was twice married. His first wife, Amy Webster King, who he married in 1886, actually died in this house in 1917, less than 2 months after they had moved in. She had surgery in February of 1917, although I haven't been able to determine the cause of her death, probably sepsis. Infection was a great problem in those days, and she died here in the house. His second wife, Grace B. Burnap, who he married in 1920, and they were married until Everett died, obviously, in 1929, is Lisa's grandmother. So that's the connection to Lisa. And actually, I think Grace Burnap is just as interesting as her husband, maybe even a little more interesting. She had an extensive musical education. She was educated at Boston Conservatory. She did further studies in New York, Munich, and Switzerland. She went on to be a professor of music at 2 different women's colleges, one in Frederick and the other in Alliance, Ohio. The most interesting thing is that I found out about her is that in 1914 she traveled with the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts when they made a study tour of Europe to look at different models for public gardens. Her brother, George Burnap, was a noted DC landscape architect, and through him, Grace had become friendly with Horace W. Peasley, who is the architect who designed the architecture, the garden architecture of Meridian Hill Park, also designed the base and the landscaping around the Iwo Jima Memorial in Arlington, and also designed all of the additions to the Cosmos Club. So Grace had an enormous connection to the arts and architecture and garden design of Washington. And Lisa was telling me the other night that she had a number of books on garden design, and she wasn't quite sure where they came from. I'm almost certain they belonged to her great-uncle George. And finally, I'm sorry, we went on. The last thing, Mr. Everett met Grace at Mrs. Henderson's Boundary Castle in 1918. She introduced them, sat them next to each other at dinner. They met, they fell in love, and thus the rest of the story. A little bit about her brother, George Burnap. Very little is known about him. His name is known, but this is the only photograph that I've been able to locate, courtesy of Lisa. He was educated at MIT, taught landscape architecture at Cornell. Horace Peasley was his student and came to Washington with him when he came to work for the DC Department of Parks as the chief landscape architect. He was the author of a respected textbook in garden design, and he was also the architect who did the preliminary elevations and designing of the retaining walls that are so distinct, such a distinctive part of Meridian Hill Park. If you go to the next slide. Grace Burnap was an accomplished performer, but she was also after she left teaching in an academic setting, she had a studio at 1124 Connecticut Avenue across from the Mayflower Hotel. That's the building that her brother had his office in. And this is a photograph of her music studio. And I want to thank Julia Brennan for helping decode the more than 30 pieces of fabric that are in this photograph, which is in the book. You'll be able to take a better look at it. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is a cover of a program of a concert that was given in 1916, and you can't see it, but the initials HWP, Horace W. Peasley, are at the bottom. I think it's quite remarkable that an architect of his magnitude in Washington architectural history would show up in Grace Burnap's materials. If we could go to the next slide. Just want to say a few things about life in Washington. The Everetts love to entertain, and we'll just see a couple of people who are here Rufo Cafiero Tita, who called himself the voice of Orion, stopped here and performed in 1921 on his way to the Met to sing at the Met for the 1922 season. Princess Elizabeth Vesco, an American who married a Romanian prince, was quite a beauty of her day and quite the socialite. First Lady Mrs. Calvin Coolidge came here for a lunch that Grace hosted in her honor, and I found this interesting picture of Mrs. Coolidge with a raccoon, and I think this would have appealed to Grace very much, because Grace, Mrs. Burnout, Mrs. Everett, was an individualist. And I think she probably appreciated Mrs. Coolidge's raccoon as she met him. And then finally, Lord Geddes, the British ambassador, was here for dinner and other entertainments on a number of occasions. Life in